Able Archer 83 was a 10-day North Atlantic Treaty Organization command post exercise starting on November 2, 1983, that spanned Western Europe. Centered on the Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe headquarters in Casteau, north of the city of Mons. Able Archer exercises simulated a period of conflict escalation, culminating in a simulated DEFCON 1 coordinated nuclear attack. The exercise also introduced a new, unique format of coded communication, radio silences, and the participation of heads of government. The realistic nature of the 1983 exercise, coupled with deteriorating relations between the United States and the Soviet Union and the anticipated arrival of Pershing II nuclear missiles in Europe, led some members of the Soviet Politburo and military to believe that Able Archer 83 was a ruse of war, obscuring preparations for a genuine nuclear first strike. In response, the Soviets readied their nuclear forces and placed air units in East Germany and Poland on alert. The apparent threat of nuclear war ended with the conclusion of the exercise on November 11. Some historians have since argued that Able Archer 83 was one of the times when the world has come closest to nuclear war since the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. Others argue the only incident that brought the world closer to such a war was the Norwegian rocket incident of 1995, prelude to NATO exercise. Operation Ryan, the greatest catalyst to the Able Archer war scare, occurred more than 2 years earlier. In a May 1981 closed-session meeting of senior KGB officers and Soviet leaders, General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev and KGB Chairman Yuri Andropov bluntly announced that the United States was preparing a secret nuclear attack on the USSR. To combat this threat, Andropov announced the KGB and GRU would begin Operation Ryan. Ryan was a Russian acronym for Nuclear Missile Attack. Operation Ryan was the largest, most comprehensive peacetime intelligence gathering operation in Soviet history. Agents abroad were charged with monitoring the figures who would decide to launch a nuclear attack, the service and technical personnel who would implement the attack, and the facilities from which the attack would originate. In all probability, the goal of Operation Ryan was to discover the first intent of a nuclear attack and then preempt it. The exact impetus for the implementation of Operation Ryan is not known for sure. Oleg Gordievsky, the highest-ranking KGB official ever to defect, attributed it to a potentially lethal combination of Reaganite rhetoric and Soviet paranoia. Gordievsky conjectured that Brezhnev and Andropov, who were very, very old-fashioned and easily influenced by communist dogmas, truly believed that an antagonistic Ronald Reagan would push the nuclear button and relegate the Soviet Union to the literal ash heap of history. Central Intelligence Agency historian Benjamin B. Fisher lists several concrete occurrences that likely led to the birth of Ryan. The first of these was the use of psychological operations that began soon after President Reagan took office. In his report, Fisher also writes that another CIA source was, at least partially, corroborating Gordievsky's reporting. This Czechoslovak intelligence officer, who worked closely with the KGB on Ryan, noted that his counterparts were obsessed with the historical parallel between 1941 and 1983. He believed this feeling was almost visceral, not intellectual, and deeply affected Soviet thinking. PSYOP psychological operations by the United States began mid-February 1981 and continued intermittently until 1983. These included a series of clandestine naval operations that stealthily accessed waters near the Greenland-Iceland-United Kingdom Gap and the Barents, Norwegian, Black, and Baltic Seas, demonstrating how close NATO ships could get to critical Soviet military bases. American bombers also flew directly towards Soviet airspace, peeling off at the last moment, occasionally several times per week. These near penetrations were designed to test Soviet radar vulnerability as well as demonstrate U.S. capabilities in a nuclear war. "It really got to them," told Drive. William Schneider, former Undersecretary of State for Military Assistance and Technology, who saw classified after-action reports that indicated U.S. flight activity. They didn't know what it all meant. A squadron would fly straight at Soviet airspace, and other radars would light up and units would go on alert. Then at the last minute the squadron would peel off and return home. In April, the United States Navy conducted Fleet X-83, the largest fleet exercise held to date in the North Pacific. U.S. aircraft and ships attempted to provoke the Soviets into reacting, allowing the U.S. Office of Naval Intelligence to study Soviet radar characteristics, aircraft capabilities, and tactical maneuvers. On April 4, at least 6 U.S. Navy aircraft flew over one of the Kuril Islands, Zeleeny Island. In retaliation, the Soviets ordered an overflight of U.S. Aleutian Islands. The Soviet Union also issued a formal diplomatic note of protest, which accused the United States of repeated penetrations of Soviet airspace. Korean Airlines Flight 007 on September 1, 1983. The Korean Airlines Flight 007 was shot down over the Sea of Japan near Monorong Island just west of Sakhalin Island over prohibited Soviet airspace. All 269 passengers and crew aboard were killed, including Congressman Larry McDonald, a sitting member of the United States House of Representatives from Georgia and president of the anti-communist John Birch Society. In conjunction with the extremely secretive PSYOPs against the Soviet Union, the attack brought relations between the two superpowers to a new public low, illustrating the historically antagonistic relations between the US and USSR in the early 1980s. The Soviet attack on Kel 007 also lends several insights into Able Archer 83. Weapons build-up. From the start, the Reagan administration adopted a bellicose stance toward the Soviet Union, one that favored matching and exceeding their strategic and global military capabilities. The administration's rigorous focus on this objective resulted in the largest peacetime military build-up in the history of the United States. It also ushered in the final major escalation in rhetoric of the Cold War. On June 8, 1982, Reagan, in a speech to the British House of Commons, declared that freedom and democracy will leave Marxism and Leninism on the ash heap of history. On March 23, 1983, Reagan announced one of the most ambitious and controversial components to this strategy, the Strategic Defense Initiative. While Reagan portrayed the initiative as a safety net against nuclear war, leaders in the Soviet Union viewed it as a definitive departure from the relative weapons parity of détente and an escalation of the arms race into space. Yuri Andropov, who had become General Secretary following Brezhnev's death in November 1982, criticized Reagan for inventing new plans on how to unleash nuclear war in the best way, with the hope of winning it. Despite the Soviet outcry over the Star Wars program, the weapons plan that generated the most alarm among the Soviet Union's leadership during Able Archer 83 was the 1979 NATO approval and planned deployment of intermediate-range Pershing II missiles in Western Europe. These missiles, deployed to counter Soviet SS-20 intermediate-range missiles on its own western border, represented a major threat to the Soviets. The Pershing II was capable of destroying Soviet hard targets, such as underground missile silos and command and control bunkers. The missiles could be emplaced in and launched from any surveyed site in minutes, and because the guidance system was self-correcting, The missile system possessed a genuine first strike capability. Furthermore, it was estimated that the missiles could reach targets in the Western Soviet Union within 4 to 6 minutes of their launch. These capabilities led Soviet leaders to believe that the only way to survive a Pershing II strike was to preempt it. This fear of an undetected Pershing II attack, according to CIA historian Benjamin B. Fisher, was explicitly linked to the mandate of Operation Ryan, to detect a decision by the United States to launch a nuclear attack and to preempt it. False alarm from the Soviet early missile warning system. On the night of September 26, 1983, the Soviet orbital missile early warning system, codenamed OKO, reported a single intercontinental ballistic missile launch from the territory of the United States. Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov, who was on duty during the incident, correctly dismissed the warning as a computer error when ground early warning radars did not detect any launches. Part of his reasoning was that the system was new and known to have malfunctioned previously. Also, a full-scale nuclear attack from the United States would involve thousands of simultaneous launches, not a single missile. Later, the system reported 4 more ICBM launches headed to the Soviet Union, but Petrov again dismissed the reports as false. The investigation that followed revealed that the system indeed malfunctioned and false alarms were caused by a rare alignment of sunlight on high-altitude clouds underneath the satellite's orbits. Exercise Able Archer 83. The exercise, codenamed Able Archer, involved numerous NATO allies and simulated NATO's command, control, and communications procedures during a nuclear war. Some Soviet leaders, because of the preceding world events and the exercise's particularly realistic nature, believed, in accordance with Soviet military doctrine, that the exercise may have been a cover for an actual attack. Indeed, a KGB telegram of February 17 described one likely scenario as such. In view of the fact that the measures involved in State Orange, a nuclear attack within 36 hours, have to be carried out with the utmost secrecy in the shortest possible time, without disclosing the content of operational plans. It is highly probable that the battle alarm system may be used to prepare a surprise Ryan nuclear attack in peacetime. February 17, 1983, KGB Permanent Operational Assignment assigned its agents to monitor several possible indicators of a nuclear attack. These included actions by a cadre of people associated with preparing and implementing decision about Ryan, and also a group of people, including service and technical personnel, those working in the operating services of installations connected with processing and implementing the decision about Ryan, and communication staff involved in the operation and interaction of these installations. Because Able Archer 83 simulated an actual release, it is likely that the service and technical personnel mentioned in the memo were active in the exercise. More conspicuously, British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl participated in the nuclear drill. United States President Reagan, Vice President George H. W. Bush, and Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger were also intended to participate. Robert McFarlane, who had assumed the position of National Security Advisor just 2 weeks earlier, realized the implications of such participation early in the exercise's planning and rejected it. Another illusory indicator likely noticed by Soviet analysts was an influx of ciphered communications between the United Kingdom and the United States. Soviet intelligence was informed that so-called nuclear consultations in NATO are probably one of the stages of immediate preparation by the adversary for Ryan. To the Soviet analysts, this burst of secret communications between the United States and the UK 1 month before the beginning of Able Archer may have appeared to be this consultation In reality, the burst of communication regarded the U.S. invasion of Grenada on October 25, 1983, which caused a great deal of diplomatic traffic as the sovereign of the island was Elizabeth II. A further startling aspect reported by KGB agents regarded the NATO communications used during the exercise. According to the Moscow Center's February 17, 1983 memo, it is of the highest importance to keep a watch on the functioning of communications networks and systems, since through them information is passed about the adversary's intentions and, above all, about his plans to use nuclear weapons and practical implementation of these. In addition, changes in the method of operating communications systems and the level of manning may in themselves indicate the state of preparation for Ryan. Soviet intelligence appeared to substantiate these suspicions by reporting that NATO was indeed using unique, never-before-seen procedures as well as message formats more sophisticated than previous exercises that possibly indicated the proximity of nuclear attack. Finally, during Able Archer 83, NATO forces simulated a move through all alert phases, from DEFCON 5 to DEFCON 1. While these phases were simulated, alarmist KGB agents mistakenly reported them as actual. According to Soviet intelligence, NATO doctrine stated, operational readiness No. 1 is declared when there are obvious indications of preparation to begin military operations. It is considered that war is inevitable and may start at any moment. Upon learning that U.S. nuclear activity mirrored its hypothesized first strike activity, the Moscow Center sent its residencies a flash telegram on November 8 or 9, incorrectly reporting an alert on American bases and frantically asking for further information regarding an American first strike. The alert precisely coincided with the 7 to 10 day period estimated between NATO's preliminary decision and an actual strike. This was the peak of the war scare. The Soviet Union, believing its only chance of surviving a NATO strike was to preempt it, readied its nuclear arsenal. The CIA reported activity in the Baltic Military District, in Czechoslovakia, and it determined that nuclear-capable aircraft in Poland and East Germany were placed on high alert status with readying of nuclear strike forces. Former CIA analyst Peter Vincent Pryor goes further, saying he suspects that the aircraft were merely the tip of the iceberg. He hypothesizes that, in accordance with Soviet military procedure and history, ICBM silos, easily readied and difficult for the United States to detect, were also prepared for a launch. Lt. Gen. Leonard H. Perutz is credited with the decision not to place NATO forces on increased alert despite increased Soviet readiness, thereby averting a potential nuclear exchange. Soviet fears of the attack ended as the Able Archer exercise finished on November 11. Upon learning of the Soviet reaction to Able Archer 83 by way of the double agent Oleg Gordievsky, a British CIS asset, President Reagan commented, "I don't see how they could believe that, but it's something to think about." A scenario released by NATO details the hypothetical lead-up to the Able Archer exercise, which was used by the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington, D.C., and the Ministry of Defense in London. Dr. Gregory Pedlow, a SHAPE historian, explains the war game. The exercise scenario began with Orange opening hostilities in all regions of ACE on the 4th of November and Blue declaring a general alert. Orange initiated the use of chemical weapons on the 6th of November and by the end of that day had used such weapons throughout ACE. All of these events had taken place prior to the start of the exercise and were simply part of the written scenario. There had thus been 3 days of fighting and a deteriorating situation prior to the start of the exercise. This was desired because, as previously stated, the purpose of the exercise was to test procedures for transitioning from conventional to nuclear operations. As a result of Orange advance, its persistent use of chemical weapons, and its clear intentions to rapidly commit second echelon forces, SACEUR requested political guidance on the use of nuclear weapons early on day one of the exercise. Soviet reaction. The double agent Oleg Gordievsky, whose highest rank was KGB resident in London, is the only Soviet source ever to have published an account of Able Archer 83. Oleg Kalugin and Yuri Shvets, who were KGB officers in 1983, have published accounts that acknowledge Operation Ryan, but they do not mention Able Archer 83. Gordievsky and other Warsaw Pact intelligence agents were extremely skeptical about a NATO first strike, perhaps because of their proximity to, and understanding of, the West. Nevertheless, agents were ordered to report their observations, not their analysis. And this critical flaw in the Soviet intelligence system, coined by Gordievsky as the intelligence cycle, fed the fear of U.S. nuclear aggression. Marshal Sergei Akromov, who at the time was chief of the main operations directorate of the Soviet General Staff, told Cold War historian Don Oberndorfer that he had never heard of Able Archer. The lack of public Soviet response over Able Archer 83 has led some historians, including Fritz W. Ermarth in his piece, Observations on the War Scare of 1983 from an Intelligence Perch, to conclude that Able Archer 83 posed no immediate threat to the Soviet Union.